get involved with us. A couple of housekeeping ideas. Be sure and introduce yourself, where you're joining from as you join us. And then we'd love to hear or see your comments and questions in the comments area as we go along. And so want to introduce our special guest today, Dave Gerber. Dave and I have been connected on LinkedIn now for longer than I can think of, Dave. And he's going to be here because his area of background, or part of his area of strength, is an area dealing with conflict. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so, Dave, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, first, thank you, gentlemen, for having me on the show. I hope that when we're finished, I've been able to provide some feedback and some thoughts that your audience can actually apply to their lives, both professionally and personally. I've been doing this work with my own business for the last 18 years, and I've had lots of clients and subcontracting work in the training, coaching, speaking engagements. Work with NASA. I've worked with Fortune 50 companies and military intelligence, schools, nonprofits. So I've really run the gamut with respect to the different companies. I am one of those people that has a particular fondness for conflict because I think that there's a lot we can do with it, particularly in society right now where it's everywhere. So I'm excited to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity.
All right, great. So Anton, you want to kind of open up the topic, or get us started towards our HR event?
Yeah, absolutely. But first, Human SOS is all about handling stress for employees and really helping people, bringing the human and organization to the forefront of leadership and company, viewpoints. And conflict brings a ton of stress on. I mean, it's not something I'm saying that's new, but unfortunately, it's not being taught and managed as well as it should be. So I'm really happy to have Dave on to help us out. I pulled up I don't know if an article or more like a research study that talks about a bunch of different stress statistics that I just want to share with the audience. And in the top right blurb there, it talks about how companies spend about 2.8 hours each week involved in employees, 2.8 hours each week involved in conflict. This amounts to around 359 billion hours that are paid and filled with and not focused on things like positive productivity, instead are spent on conflict. The figure is equivalent to 385 million days on the job going towards the goal of arguing, as opposed to being put forward towards collaboration. Now, this may seem like, conflict's all bad. That's not what we're saying. And hopefully Dave is probably going to agree with me, but conflict is a necessary thing in order to solve things, because otherwise you have groupthink. And we know what happens. We have many stories throughout history where groupthink led to a lot of bad things happening. Titanic is a great example of that. But here's some statistics that I pulled out of there. 60% of employees never receive basic conflict management. Kev, I don't have those memorized, man. You got to go back.
Sorry about that. Clicking the wrong buttons.
Is it possible I could jump in here and just say one thing?
Absolutely, jump right in.
What I want to share is, one, the statistics are from 2008, but I will tell you that I did a presentation for 80 project managers from the DMV. And I actually have a tool that people right now, don't go now, wait till after the show, but conflictcalculator.com. Okay, it's a tool that I put together so that people could start to have the discussion in their businesses, because while doing the right thing for people, we would hope would motivate companies, we all know that it's got to have the fiscal side to it. So this calculator allows people to start having discussion. One of those individuals, and I'm not going to name the company that they were from, but I guessed it because they have 44,000 employees, had this individual project manager believe that they were wasting $500 million a year. This was in 2018. So we're talking about, even in the reporting numbers, because people dislike conflict so much, they're not even being honest about how much conflict they're actually facing. So I really recommend people go check out that tool, because it allows you to plug in salaries rounded for managers, employees, and supervisors, and you can get a really full picture of how much money is being lost. So hopefully that'll help your audience.
Absolutely. That's awesome, Dave. Thanks so much for sharing that. You got some shout outs, Kev.
Yeah, we got Karen and Rosemary. Good to see you guys this morning. They're become regulars on our Human SOS show, and are regulars on my Wisdom Seeker. And good morning, Jeffrey. Glad to have you. And I'm going to actually be meeting in person with Jeffrey after we're done this morning. So glad to have you and appreciate you joining in.
Yeah, so just real quick running through these stats, right? 60% of employees never receive basic conflict management, while 85% of employees experience some sort of conflict. To me, that's just a huge disconnect. And I think these are much fresher stats than the other ones. I think this was actually updated in 2021. 34% of workplace conflict happens among employees on the front line. 34% of workplace conflict is a result of workplace stress, right? So this is something that me and Kev talk a lot about, and much of it can be prevented because it's not productive conflict. 25% of employees have witnessed absence or sickness due to conflict, and 9% of employees have seen projects fail because of workplace conflict, and that can get expensive. Kev, any thoughts? Dave, any thoughts on those?
Yeah, I'd say that the disconnect has been there for a long time. You pointed it out, rightfully so. And so we have to look at what are the priorities within individual organizations. How progressive are they thinking about the impact? You know, it's amazing the power of words. You know, we learn that when somebody uses a word, the person who hears it decodes it in their own version of their own language to then try and interpret meaning. And I mean, that's where lots of things go wrong. If we were to change the word conflict out and start using the word wellness, it's amazing how people would decode the word wellness so differently when, in fact, in order to create wellness, we have to address conflict. So we need to stop seeing conflict. I wish we could spell it with 4 letters because it's like a 4-letter dirty word, you know, that nobody wants to use. And in reality, it's like project management. If we just take away the energy around the word and start to use it, we can start to address all these kinds of issues. And I'm not sure, and I think not to go too far in a different direction, but I think organizations are going to have to start to figure out what their priority is around human experience, because by 2030, the report is 400 to 800 million global jobs will be gone. So they have to decide what is the priority in how we have these humans that are here interacting with one another, seeing is it connected to productivity, seeing is it connected to retention and loyalty, and trying to reduce, you know, and improve on these statistics.
Yeah, I guess I'm not surprised at the data because, as Dave and both of you said, we've got a problem that's been around for a while, and companies have swept it under the rug, shifted it to the side, and of course, the common responses to the problem, without identifying the causes, is that we buy pool tables, ping pong tables, get yoga classes. Some, you know, whatever, and we're putting band-aids on a wound that is getting infected and growing worse each day. So yeah, and welcome, Sharon, one of our regulars. Glad to have you here this morning. But yeah, we've got a problem, and conflict is one of the symptoms of it. And you know, we of course continue to talk about stress and trying to get to the root of it. And if we can figure out and hopefully offer some suggestions to our audience on how to de-energize conflict, as Dave's mentioned, I think we'll go a long way, and then and get down to the source of it. So definitely.
I like Dave's, conflictcalculator.com. And Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like you said, until they see the fiscal side of this, they're not going to make the changes. Well, we're the same way with stress, right? Until people see truly the broader picture and all the trickle down effects, right? All the things that not necessarily right in their front of their eyes, and the turnover that's connected to it, lack of productivity, lack of engagement, failures in projects, as we mentioned, until that happens, people are not going to make the change, but they're going to be forced to. And companies that are getting ahead of the game and thinking about this not before 2030 and all this stuff's going to happen are going to be the ones that are going to be winning in a very competitive market.
If we make an analogy to happiness, one of the reasons why many people are not happy is because they've created such a small, narrow definition of what is required in order to be happy. And it's the same thing with conflict. It's the same thing with the workplace. It's like there's this definition of how things have to be. And if it's very rigid, there's not the stepping back and seeing, oh, wow, we can actually find happiness in all these small places. We can find solutions to conflict in organizations in small places. We have to really shift our thinking to understand that this is not really that difficult. The tools that we need in order to move ourselves forward are not tough tools. We just have to get ourselves in a mindset where we're going to find some balance, I guess, between logic and emotion, especially when it comes to conflict. And that's one of the things that we're seeing that is more and more fleeting in our society. We're heavily more leaning towards emotion, and that's not going to be helpful when we get into conflict situations and try and solve them.
Yeah, it usually inflames things. Welcome, Ravi. Glad to have you this morning. And Jeffrey's got a question. He's going to throw us right into the thick of it here with this question is, he says, I suspect you'll get to this, but what is the most significant root cause of conflict?
That's awesome, Jeffrey. I think we owe you $20 because that's actually where that was the segue of what I wanted to offer, which is actually a tool that the entire audience and you can use to answer that question and to really get a leg up on solving conflict. So Christopher Moore, a theorist who created what he called the 5 sources of conflict, and that all conflict, whatever kind, can fit into one or more of those 5 sources. Now, the way we use this tool is we're actually going to try and find the primary source. And that's one of the problems that a lot of organizations and people and families, they have is that they're solving the wrong problem. And so when we can take 2 steps back, we can make a better step forward. I'm not sure how old the audience is, but some of them might remember those overhead projectors that we had in high school where it was like a little gerbil was running around in a cage, throwing the light up, and they put this, this plastic transparency over top. And right, I want to offer you a transparency that you can throw over top of any conflict, whether it's at the home, whether it's at a church, whether it's a synagogue, wherever you pray, wherever you live, wherever you work, whatever you do. It's one of those tools that's really so basic, but that sometimes people dismiss it. But I've actually had a lot of clients recently that are having me talk just about this. So the 5 sources of conflict, the first one, and remember, if we don't solve them, they get more and more difficult to solve. So the first one is data. It's the lowest level conflict. It's information. We're having a conflict about, and to your audience who asked the question about root cause, this is how I would answer that. These are sources, 5 sources, 5 root causes. So we've got data. Maybe we disagree on the data. Maybe we disagree on the source. Maybe we disagree. Maybe you didn't give me the data. So the first one is data. And what happens is a lot of times we have data conflicts that don't get solved that then over time turn into a relationship conflict, but we're getting there. So the second kind is an expectation conflict. So source number 2 or root source number 2 is an expectation or an interest conflict. I expect you to be home at 10. Well, I expect to be home at 9. I expect the meeting to start at 3. Well, I expect to start at 2. I expected the work to be in on Tuesday. You wanted to bring it on Thursday. Expectation conflicts, I would argue, of the 5 are the most common in the workplace because they're often not even discussed. It's like, well, Joe's supposed to be here at 9. Well, does Joe know? And it's like, well, he should know. Okay, so expectation conflicts. So we've got data, then we got expectations. The third one is relationships. I just don't like you, right? I mean, I go by the 80-20 rule. For the most part, 10% of people you might invite to your house, 10% you never want to see again, and 80% of the people you work with are somewhere in the middle, right? Sort of a generalization. But relationship conflicts come from history, or what I see is data and expectation conflicts that have not been addressed over time turn into relationship problems. If every single Friday I have to go to Anton to get him to sign a piece of work order for me to leave at 3 o'clock, and every time at 3 o'clock I show up to his desk, he's never there, how many times before I start to get upset and now have a problem with Anton? But the issue, that's a data issue. Like if Anton's like, hey, I didn't even know. Like I thought, like what if you meet me instead of my office, we meet at 3 o'clock because I had this meeting from 2 that just ends. And I'm like, hey, perfect. That's right around the corner. I'll meet you there, sign my paper, I go home. There's no relationship problem. but we made one because we didn't address the easier conflicts in data or expectation. Fourth, one of the most frustrating root sources of conflict for people is structural conflict. Within organizations, if you don't make the rules, if you can't change the rules, then why are you arguing or having a conflict with a colleague who also can't make or change the rules? So we sometimes, like for instance, like I don't want our health insurance to come from here. I want it to come from here. Well, I want it to come from here. Well, unless you're the one who's in charge of HR and the C-suite deciding where health insurance comes from, why are we arguing about that? But it is very frustrating. And we're talking about processes, procedures, rules, standard operating procedure, things that were made by this third party, the organization, and we're just colleagues in that context. The fifth and last one is values. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, values is really tough because, Kevin, if I were to ask you to change your values, would you do that? You probably would laugh at me and you'd say,
I wouldn't go there.
Right. You'd say, go pound sand, and now we have another conflict, right? So, but values in the workplace show up as behaviors. And we can talk about behaviors in the workplace. So someone might say, well, I have a work-life balance value, which means I work 35 hours and then whatever is up, I'm going home. And you might have a boss who says, well, I'm not going to talk about your value system. You're allowed to have your value system. At this organization, we work a 40-hour week. And so you need to decide how to have your balance, and also can you meet the expectations of what we have as a company? And that's how managers actually can start to talk about value-based conflicts. But as we see right now, particularly in COVID, we have a lot of value-based conflicts. And we have to start to address these conflicts of all kinds. But now you have a tool. So now it becomes easier because in the conflict community, we say, if you can name it, you can change it. Right? So if we can start to name it. Now, let's say Kevin and Anton have a conflict over something, but they both have the language to be able to step back and think about, well, what's the root or the primary source? They can now sit down, and even if they disagree, can have a better conversation with each other, which means the positive byproduct of that conflict is maybe you strengthen your relationship even if you don't agree on what the primary source is. Conflict is about setting precedent of how we're going to behave and work with each other in the future. And so the last thing I'll say about this tool, and I'm happy to take any questions, is you have to work to identify the primary source. Every conflict, you go, oh, well, it's a little this and it's a little that. Well, once you start to do that, the tool loses all its value. You're really trying to come up and name what is the primary source. Because if we hearken back to the example I gave about Anton and myself and me needing his signature before I could leave work on a Friday, that's a data conflict. It's not really a personal conflict. But if we're not going to get in the game and have the vocabulary and identify the primary root sources, we're going to create more and more and more relationship conflicts. And I'm sure you might agree that if you just thought about the landscape of an organization, you might automatically think, well, relationship conflicts are like number one. People just can't get along. Things are crazy in society. It's not true. It's not true. So identify the primary root cause, and then you can be better at deciding and defining what are going to be your solutions. This is particularly important because in conflict, we're looking for long-term solutions. We don't need short, small solutions that we have to revisit because nobody likes conflict. So let's take care of it at one time, get on the same page, and then move forward together.
That's strange. Is that any better?
Yep.
Okay. So Ravi makes a comment. Want to put up, says root cause of conflict is different mindsets are trying to work together to achieve a common goal.
So in the context of what I just shared, that would be an expectation conflict.
Okay.
Right? Can you put that back up? Can we see that comment again?
Sure.
So root cause of conflict is different mindsets are trying to work together to achieve a common goal. So these different mindsets have an expectation about how something is supposed to be. And that expectation, whether discussed or not discussed, is different than the other. And then they have a conflict. So the reason that we use this, the reason that I encourage people to use this sources of conflict tool is because it gives some common language for us all to have in our vocabulary to allow us to then move forward. Remember, we've got 100, how many countries are there in the world? 190 something, 195? Like, we have people from all over the world, whether it's working in our building or virtual or with a subcontractor or something, where everybody has a different definition of conflict. Everybody has a different way to solve it. And we have to start to standardize in a way that provides skeletons for people to have anchors of tools that will work. And then they can include their personality on top of it, because you can't ask somebody to be somebody they're not. But we can give them tools like this to then go, oh, okay. And now it's replicatable. So your caller who just put up that question can go back into his office and say, hey, let's look at these conflicts and let's talk about them with the same vocabulary. And I think we're more likely to be able to then move forward together.
Yeah, welcome, Ann. Glad to have you this morning. And Dave, something that you're talking about this conflict model, conflict resolution model. I think one of the things I always learned, and this was more pointed at relationships, but I think it fits. The framework gives us a way to focus on the problem and not each other, because you can land on one of those areas identified as the area of conflict and deal with the conflict and not the people. And
yes, the harder the problem, the softer we are on the people.
Yeah, because again, the focus is different, and so I appreciate that. And Rosemary, thanks for coming along. I know it's late in your day. Rosemary's from Sydney, Australia, and so she's late in the evening. And Dave, you got some sympathy on the projector thing. I wasn't going to give in, but yes, I've actually, in training trainers, had to train trainers how to use them correctly. So I'm giving a little indication of my age. And so appreciate that analogy. And in fact, I think Rosemary said she still got one of the projectors. I need to borrow that from you sometime, Rosemary, just for old time's sake. I don't know. And Ann's joining, by the way, from Texas. So good to hear that. Anton, thoughts on the tool?
I mean, I wish I had this, about 5 years ago when I was managing sales teams, because, when you said balance between logic and emotion, it's so key in managing conflict. But when you go to a bunch of competitors that are, running on fumes of energy because they're living on energy drinks, so their stress is through the roof, and you're trying to solve conflict and you're going, hey, stop being so emotional. Worst thing you can say to them, right? It just, it triggers them, it upsets them. But if instead I came around and said, okay, you two sit down, because usually it wasn't a conflict with me and somebody else. It was me managing conflict between two other people. You two sit down and define what this conflict is. What am I doing in that process? I'm making them bring reason into conversation and switch from a really heightened emotional state into logic without having to say anything about emotion. They just naturally would transition there, and they would sit there, define it, and then would find a solution from that standpoint. So I wish I had this 5 years ago.
Yeah, it's really interesting how in my work, the tools I've used, and I don't use them particularly as sales tools, but it's very interesting how these tools do translate very much so into the sales community. The one model that I teach, that's sort of my bread and butter that I created myself. It's like I do 8 hours, 2 hour to 8 hour trainings on, that model translates into a sales model, because fundamentally we're trying to figure out people's underlying interests and needs, right? And that's what in sales, what we're trying to do is we're trying to meet their underlying interests and needs. And so being able to have language like this to be able to step back. Yeah. And Anton, it goes to, in some ways, your feeling goes to the statistic that you provided on the first slide, which is 65% of people don't ever get any basic conflict management skills. So now, Anton, you are now in the moment, the first guy giving these two people conflict management skills. And the likelihood is you have 30,000 other things to do as a sales manager. You can't sit down and give them an 8-hour training. So now you're like, okay, well, I'm going to give you the best I can give you in the moment, right? And you're trying to make up for, and this is what we're all trying to do. We're all trying to make up for what wasn't taught to people before they come into us. You said you'd like to have this 5 years ago. I would argue that you probably, and I don't know how old you are, so I'll just say I bet you wish you had this in high school. This isn't rocket science, right? This is like I don't want to call it lying by omission, but it's like the omission of things that are so important to us in our lives that would make such a huge critical change that have been socialized out. I mean, in 7th grade, my daughter told me that for 4 years, she learned the same thing in health class. For 4 years, learned the same thing over and over again. But they don't teach you about pH in your body. They don't teach you about meditation. They don't teach you, but they're going to repeat. So then we bring these people out of school, we put them here, and we just expect them to know how to solve these things, and they just don't. And it's not even their fault. Not to mention the intercultural issues that we have with respect to just having people from all over. I mean, if you're from India or Maine or Australia or Zimbabwe, you're solving problems and conflict differently. And so my argument is, hey, let's get everybody on the same page with some skeleton tools that now people who've never been taught, or people who think they've been taught, because how many people do you know who think they're masters at conflict management and they're actually the one causing all the problems?
Welcome, Wanji. Glad to have you with us. Again, I like the idea of the conflict management tool because what you've established is a common ground to meet on. Part of conflict is that we never find a common ground that we can work from to then try to figure out what's going on versus just continuing to hold the ground that we're on. And
you know, on common ground, an interesting that happens from my experience is you might have two people that come together to talk about 10 things and they agree on 7 of them, but they start their conversation talking about the 3 they disagree on. Now, by the end, how many of those 7 that they agreed on originally do you think they still agree on? Right? They've probably actually gone backwards and said, hey, you're being such a jerk. You know, I was gonna call today Tuesday, but you know, I'm not gonna call it Tuesday anymore.
Well, what's really funny, and this is something I have struggled with early in my life, and that was dealing with certain personality types because of my own insecurities. And what was we had and this was a colleague, so this showed up at work, and our boss laughed at us one time because he said that when he would watch us, sometimes we would be arguing, but we agreed with each other, but we would still argue about it. So finding common ground is important, and that I like the tool that you shared because that's a way to start finding some common ground there.
I'm curious if your caller had any feedback, the one that asked the question about the root sources of, if they're still with us.
Let's see. Ravi. He commented, kind of interesting that talking about values, that it's a major conflict point. And he also added that concerned that that's one that's real deep. And it's true, you know, value conflict is a deep conflict, assuming that it's a strongly held value. I would challenge that if it's not strongly held, it's not really a value, but that's another discussion for another day.
And Kevin, there was a key, the first comment you put up. Can you put that one back of the 2 you just showed? Because there was a key word, there was a conflict management word. Rightly said, Dave, no compromise. Okay, so let's talk about compromise for a second. So another tool, and I actually took an advanced conflict management class with Ralph Kilman. If you're really interested in this, he's the godfather of conflict management, Ralph Kilman. And he, with a partner, created the TKI. Some of you might have used it before, the Thomas Kilman instrument. And that's a basic conflict management tool people want to become familiar with because it allows them to have insight into themselves on what is their default mode of how they deal with conflict. It also gives them insight onto other people and how they are going to. And there are 5. It's let's see. There's avoid. There is accommodate. There's compromise. There's collaborate, and there's right. Well, compromise is that one that's in the middle, right? And we hear about compromise all the time. And I want to just point this out as a little nugget for people around compromise. Remember that compromise is a solution methodology we use for low-level conflicts. We're not going to use compromise for anything that's not low level. So Kevin wants to go for Mexican and Anton wants to go for Chinese. They might compromise and go and find a place. But when you compromise on important issues, it is lose-lose. Because if you're there to get your needs met and the other person is there to get their needs met and neither of you get any needs met, it's lose-lose. So be careful and getting sucked into this, I'm compromising, because if it's a high-level issue or a conflict, it's probably going to create more issue, which is why we're trying to move people obviously to collaborate, where we create win-wins and people give up a little bit. So just keep those compromises to the low-level conflicts.
Right. Yeah, because usually compromise doesn't leave anybody fulfilled or satisfied with the result. In fact, Ravi makes a comment along those lines, and rightly said, Dave, conflict management becomes perfect if we can agree to disagree. And that's a skill that is so lost now. And I believe that that's based in insecurities with people. We are so determined to be validated by being right that we will fight to the death on being right when it's not really necessary to do. We can at times just say, I see your point and I appreciate it. I even respect you for it, but we just disagree on it. Anton, thoughts?
I think a lot of issues, from conflict come from people's inability to negotiate. They don't really know how to negotiate. They don't understand how to sit down and understand people's true positions and people's true interests and say, okay, this is all my cards on the table. Maybe here I'm going to help you win this one, but because now I've laid a bunch of other things out, you're going to help me here, and we both win in this situation. Maybe not in this exact, problem, but in the way we walk away feeling like we are victorious in some way or some form. But people feel like discussing conflict is uncomfortable, negotiations is uncomfortable. So this first solution is compromise. Let's just go to get out of this as fast as I possibly can. And I think that's something we got to grow as a society.
You're right on the money. And that's what I've spent the last almost 2 decades going to companies and teaching them. I had it actually, I didn't even think I was going to bring it, but just to show you I'm not full of it. I've created a model which gets right to your point, predetermined. I just changed a little bit of the language because I think people understand predetermined outcomes better than positions. It's like the people are walking into the office with like, we're going to Orlando. And it's like, no, we're going to Bermuda. And it's like Orlando, Bermuda. And when we're solving conflicts from positions or predetermined outcomes, we have about a 12.5% chance of success. So to your point, it's not only about getting people don't even understand their own interests oftentimes before they get into a discussion, and therefore they can't visualize an outcome, right? It's a lot easier to get into a conflict than it is to get out, right? So that's why I spend a lot of time trying to prepare people. And this is a negotiation model, Anton. So this is when I talk about, you could probably see this as a sales model. It's the same thing. You're going to have third party, information that's going to impact you and your decision making and your solutions. So yeah, we really need to, and that's why, and this goes back, and I'm probably a broken record. Maybe it's my mission, is we've got to give people of all different diverse backgrounds a skeleton or a model. And I made this model off of the work. You probably remember the books, Getting to Yes, Getting Past No. Uri and Fisher have a whole cottage industry on that. Now, respectfully, the one place that I think that they missed is where the rubber meets the road. Whether it's a sales call or a conflict meeting we have at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, I can plan all day with my model, with the first words out of my mouth. How do we teach people to create disarming statements that get people to take a deep breath and go, I didn't think I was going to hear that. That sounds good. Tell me more. And until we can get people to create disarming statements that allow people to get into and gain entree into difficult discussions, people will continue to stick their foot in their mouth, and they will continue to stop before they start. So disarming, lastly, I think I'll say, not to leave people hanging, but disarming statements are created from me stepping back and thinking about, let's say, Anton's underlying needs. And then I pick one of those or two of those and I put them into a statement, and I deliver that statement as the first thing that I talk, and then I stop.
That's like Jeffrey's comment there, Kev. You can pull that up because that ties right into it.
It fits right in, that start by seeking to understand, rather than to be, to be understood. Try to figure out how to understand, and it does help me work through data and expectation difference by stepping back. So I think that fits right in what you're talking about, Dave, is to find that neutral spot where you don't have that emotional reaction, you don't have the emotional inflammation, if you will, of the situation.
And we listen to understand, not to problem solve. And most of us are socialized to hear to problem solve. So we have to actually, so much of this is like getting out of our own way, right? It's like, I got to identify my own thing. It's like, I'm a problem solver. That's what I do. Give me the information, and I'll give it back to you. And as we know, and if you've ever been married before, or if you ever want to be married, your partner is not always looking for a solution, right? They just want to be heard. So making sure that you're understanding, and you could do a whole show on, how to ensure that people are actually communicating and listening well with body language and voice and all that stuff.
I'll share a video that everyone should watch at some point. To your point, Dave, it's called "It's Not About the Nail," and
I've seen that.
Have you seen that?
Yeah,
it helps recognize that whole "I got to fix it" thing. And I'm one of those. Something comes up, boy, I dive in and automatically I'm looking for ways to fix it. And especially
the other thing is, we can start. This is where the whole skill set thing comes in, and it's like we can start to better manage these conversations by sometimes, where appropriate, creating boundaries by asking questions. Hey, Kevin, before you tell me what you're going to share with me, are you curious to have me give my feedback to you, or would you like me to listen so I can hear you? And now he says exactly what he wants. And I'm not sitting there trying to think about how much of an answer am I supposed to give. He might say, well, I want you to hear me. And then if you have any, sort of thoughts off the top of your head, that'd be great. Now he just gave me permission, which is one of the things that we need to start doing in a conflict management situation, is asking permission. Hey, would it be okay, Anton, if I shared with you my thoughts on this conflict we had on the engineering project? I have to be open to him to say no, because he might say, no, Dave, I don't have time right now, but we can meet back at 3:00. So, but once I say, hey, Anton, I know it's early and you're drinking your coffee, would it be okay if I shared a couple thoughts about our meeting yesterday? And he goes, yeah. And I'm like thinking to myself, he just gave me a total way in to be able to share what I want to share. And I didn't jam it down his throat because I asked him for permission. So some of these little things, like I said, it's not rocket science, but when we start to do some of these little things, think about your teachers in the past, the people you've had in your bosses in the past. How much less stress would you have had if they had the skill to come in and say, let's take it out of a school teacher. Because I used to teach in a former life, I used to teach high school. If I was having a really crummy day, I'd come in and say, hey, listen, guys, you did nothing wrong. I want you to know you did nothing wrong. I just have had a rough day, and I just want to let you know, so if I'm a little bit short, you did nothing wrong, right? And, of course, those kids totally responded to that. They understand expectations now, and actually they're more likely to want to be supportive. But we just don't want to share that information, and we want people to figure it out on their own. And now we go back to decoding what people are saying and what they're doing based upon our own experience with body language and voice and all that stuff.
Yeah, having been a high school teacher, Dave, I can completely identify with that. And I learned at one point, yeah, you got to walk in and say, today's not the day to test my nerves.
Yeah, the great thing for me, and I'm a father, and we'll have my daughter one day say to me, "Hey, Dad, you didn't do anything wrong. I just want to let you know I'm not feeling great today." In my head, I'm crying with happiness. I'm like, "Wow, she got it already. She's 14 years old, and now hopefully she will use that same skill everywhere she goes when she's self-aware, right?" Because we talk about team conflict and all this, but we all know it's a bunch of individuals that are all showing up, and how we manage our own stuff, right, before we come in really has a big impact on whether or not my partners or colleagues or teams can actually, work with me and collaborate with me.
Dave, I got a question for you, man. So, we have these definitions for different types of conflict. Say I'm a manager, and A, I should hire you and make my life easier, but B, if I don't do or have access to you to do that, how do I go about assessing and trying to identify some of these root causes on my team or the most prevalent types of conflict?
So the first thing I would say is do the conflict calculator so you're motivated to realize why you're actually doing it. It's not just for the people, but it's also for this large chunk of money. That's likely to get the CFO on your side and wanting to support. So now you're getting C-suite top cover who says, yeah, we got the message now. So I think the first thing is, and if I don't answer your question, restate it for me, but I think the first thing is we've got to get a common vocabulary on our team in order for people to identify what's going on and be able to articulate it in a way that's less emotional and more around the problem. I guess kind of where Kevin was going earlier, less around the people and more on what the problem is. And we need to have some basic conflict fluency so that we can share. We need to have a team. I use the team performance model, Drexler Civet model. I would encourage your people to check that out. It's a prescriptive and a diagnostic tool used to create high performance teams. In some ways, I feel like I'm giving you kind of a shotgun answer, which I don't mean to, because there is a lot of stuff, but I think it's about, and I come back to this. You have to hire me to get this. I say in jest, but you have to have some model. If it's not mine, it's somebody's. And I'm having a meeting today with a really big organization, and that's going to be my feedback. It's like, hey, when the rubber meets the road, when you want people to communicate with one another about tough stuff, how are they going to do it? How are you going to get all these people that have different ways of communicating on the same page? How are you going to do that? And I think that's the first challenge, because that goes to collaboration, it goes to communication, it goes to introspection, it goes to planning. I mean, you can't just fill out a model on the fly. You got to take some time to do that. Ben Franklin said, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And unfortunately, in many ways, we're moving from meeting to meeting to meeting, and this, to kids, to phones, to emails, to texts, that we don't have time to slow down and even think about, well, what are my needs? So we show up with almost like a half answer. And then when we get done, we're wondering, why are we not happy? Why are we not satisfied? Because we didn't do the preparation before we had the difficult discussions. So I'm going to flip back to you, Anton, because I'm not sure if I totally answered your question.
Well, in a roundabout way, you did, because, usually I would say, okay, if you're trying to figure out what's going on, assess, survey, find out from people what the type of conflict is. But we usually do that without having a model, without teaching some basic foundation. So then what we uncover is a bunch of jumbled up language that's hard to decipher and get to the root of what's going on. But what I would do is, based on what you're saying, is go and teach these 5 different frameworks of conflict and say, okay, now with those definitions, now I'm going to go survey and see which one is the most prevalent and be able to get people speaking the same language. And then it's easy for me to see which one is the worst.
So I would say yes. And I would add a little bit to that. And I would say, the appreciative inquiry model would be something that someone would come into your organization, or I guess if there weren't funds, a manager would have to look it up on their own, the appreciative inquiry model, and establish a series of questions that you would then use to go through the organization to get feedback, to then be able to pinpoint where you wanted to focus. The one thing I will say with that is that we have to be careful as organizations. with surveys, because there's nothing like kicking, once you kick the beehive, you can't get the bees back in the hive, right? So it's like, how many times have organizations surveyed their people and then done nothing?
Mm.
You want to talk about morale tanking? It's like, what? You just want to know what's wrong and now you're not going to do anything about it? It's like, who are you? It's like, talk about a way to get people upset. So the appreciative inquiry model will hopefully uncover what the real issue is, because if we don't uncover the real issue, right? And you could use the sources of conflict as a part of your appreciative inquiry model. But what happens is, and I worked for a major organization that solved the wrong problem. And I'm like, guys, it's in the data. They're telling you that what you say is the problem is not the problem. The data says this is the problem, which is very common around the issue of trust. A lot of times when the issue is culturally is trust, organizations will throw money at lots of different other things, but not get to the issue. Trust is the number one reason why people leave. They leave their direct supervisor, lack of trusting relationship with the direct supervisor. Number two reason they leave is lack of trusting relationships with their colleagues. So trust would be another area that I would want to look at within an organization early on, to sort of get more feedback and data around what is really the problem.
A couple of comments from our audience. Jeffrey comments that he appreciated the perspective of listening to understand versus listening to resolve a problem, changes the focus. And then Karen makes a real good comment about what Dave was talking about earlier. As a teacher, you're transparent, you own where you're at, and being transparent with folks by its very nature quite often will head off some conflict that way. And then Ann was echoing Jeffrey's comment, not just listening. We start thinking about what we're going to say in return, which is for me, I can't speak to anybody else, but I'm still practicing how to be an active listener so that I'm not formulating a response. That's just because my brain's wired, boy. As soon as somebody says, "Oh, we got a problem," I'm looking for solutions. It's all over the place, and that's not likely a healthy first approach anyway. So yeah, a lot of challenges that we're facing, and part of, I think, the reason we're seeing more conflict rather than less is the dehumanization of the workforce. And I just think that when, for example, Anton and I talk about how implementing new technologies can be a real stressor because everybody assumes, well, okay, this is plug and play, so everybody should be able to do it. So what's the problem? And we haven't addressed one of the basic problems is the human element and the differences between humans. And like you said, Dave, it could become a value thing, could be data, who knows, but just to assume because it's plug and play in our computer doesn't mean it's plug and play in our world.
Well, I think that this is a real tough one, because we're talking about like the ethics, and we're talking about the decision making from people who are responsible to shareholders. I mean, if somebody came to you and said, "Hey, if we fire these 50 people, our company can make another $10 million a year," that's a really, really tough thing to put anybody in. And depending on where you sit is where you stand, right? So if you're an employee, you're like, hey. If you're a shareholder, you're like, go for it. So as we move towards the digitization, and we're even talking about working with robots in the office, or look at the auto industry, people who have part computers that are, this is where we're going. And so this is what, I guess, specializing in conflict and wellness, I guess what I would say is this: if we want to stand out as we move forward and to show our value as a human employee, we're going to have to be really good at stuff like conflict management. Because when the line is 1,000 deep for 5 jobs, the expectation is going to be you know how to play nice with the people that are on your team when you get there. There's not going to be any room for that.
Soft skills become huge at that point. And, I
would say before you continue, I'd say not only the huge, but they're now baseline. It's like when I started my company, 18 years ago, if you didn't have a website, you were passing basic stink tests. You're going to have to just pass a basic test. You're not going to get any credit for it. You're just going to need to be good at conflict management. It's not going to be standout unless you're being hired for that role, which is very few people. It's just like we all have to raise our baseline level of conflict management skills, because that's going to be the expectation, whether it's stated or not stated, as the crunch on jobs happen.
Yeah.
And to me, it's not even just about soft skills, but the part that stands out to what you just said, Dave, is personal ownership on the employee side. You have to not just depend on somebody providing somebody stakeholder theory is a real thing, but it's not as common as shareholder theory, unfortunately, right? And as much as we like to talk about in HR world, that stakeholder theory is prevalent. No, shareholder theory is still the dominant legal system in most states still. So we can't be naive and say, well, they should do the right thing by me. No, you need to make yourself so irreplaceable that they're going to do the right thing because they have to, right? And I love that personal ownership that you're putting on it.
Yeah, and it's very easy not to do the personal ownership because we weren't taught it. So it's very easy to go, well, they didn't teach it to me, so don't blame me, right? And it's like, okay, well, now if you're trying to elevate and trying to be a lifelong learner, trying to get better, you realize that it doesn't work. The system failed us as humans around conflict management. That's what happened. And so now we have to project manage that part of our own life, right? How many people you that have health issues have realized you better project manage your entire health issue, because the person that I'm going to has 1,000 patients, and as much as they care and as great bedside manner they have, they're not paying attention to the nuances that are happening in my body on a daily basis that I need to be aware of to better manage myself. So I think that's the issue too.
Jeffrey's got a great question. This is something I always get hit with in regards to trying to be a leader in a non-leader environment. So similar here, how well do these techniques work if you're the only one on the team using them?
That's a great question. So I think you'd agree that it's obviously impossible to give you a percentage, answer. But this is what I would say. And when I teach people these concepts and the models, and that question always comes up. Yeah, but what about all the people that aren't here today? And we all chuckle and we laugh and we go, yeah, it's too bad they're not here. The better I am, the better other people will be in my presence. Not everyone, but if I'm relaxed, not putting off a mad dog energy, if I'm respectful, I'm slower, my hand motions are not all over, I'm listening to understand, as we've talked about. When I'm doing these things, it's very difficult for someone to keep yelling at me. Another technique is you just talk softer, not to the point where you're annoying, like you're baiting them, but you just kind of, and this goes back to our own personal, and I've really tripled down on meditation in the last 2 years. And I can tell you that it's been the best thing ever in my entire life, across the board of all aspects of my life, whether it's parenting, whether it's business guy, whether it's in sports, whatever it is being able to be in better control and better grounded. Not my monkeys, not my issues, not my problems. Those are your issues. I don't have to own those. And for people who are empaths, this can be very difficult because we feel a lot. We feel that energy. We have to do the work on ourselves to insulate ourselves and yet still be present and there for them. But to remember that this is not our stuff. And some people, it doesn't matter how good we are at conflict management. They're just either having a bad day. This is an important, Robin Williams, I think, was the one who said, you never know what battles people are fighting, be kind. Like, we don't know whose medication is off. You know, I mean, I might be talking about thyroid medication. I take thyroid medication. It takes 6 to 8 weeks to change a dosage for my body to change. Whether they had a loss in the family, whether they're stressed about their kid going to college. Like, there's all this stuff going on. And I think we step back and go, you know what? I think most people fundamentally want to be happy. I think that's what they want to be. And I think sometimes when they do bad things, when they cut you off or whatever, that person is still wanting to be happy. They're still trying to live their life. Don't take it personally. That's like the biggest thing is like, try not to. It's hard when it's coming at you, but try not to take it personally and try to be able to be more relaxed and to be more prepared, because when we're prepared for conflict, then we don't, our cage doesn't get rattled as fast because we can be grounded in what we've prepared in. And I'm sure, Anton, you'd say the same thing as in sales. Like, if you're nervous about something, well, you're less nervous if you're more prepared. When the person starts flipping out about the price, you either your heart rate can go and your vibration can give off tension, or you can just sit there and most salesmen know that if you don't say anything, you're most likely going to get the sale. So really, the physiological side of ourselves has to match. There has to be congruence, or alignment is the word we would use. Alignment between our verbal, our vocal, and our visual.
And Anton, I didn't prompt Dave on balance and those things. Dave, we always are talking about balance and congruence. And so Mwanji makes a comment here. Says he wants to bring to the table that a week back had a problem with a friend on Facebook, said bad things about their organization. When they called to get clarification from him, he eventually disappointed us when he did not come when he gave us the right day. Okay, so the short version is that tried to attempt to resolve the conflict and the person no-shows.
Well, Gandhi said you can't clap with one hand.
Yeah.
You know? And it doesn't matter if it's a divorce, if it's a workplace divorce, if it's whatever type. There's also a lot of this, what we call fire and forget, feedback from people, where it's like, especially with Facebook, with digital social media, there's no interpersonal interface. So it's less, as you would say, humanized. So we just fire and forget it. Just put it out there and go. Also, it shows to me that the desire level of that individual to get closure is not really there, because they're not willing to step up when given an opportunity to make things right. They're choosing not to make things right. So it's a fire and forget kind of thing. My attitude is delete their comment off your organization's website and move on.
Yeah. I think something that we've kind of danced around and even talked about is a good starting point for all of us to be able to begin the process of effective conflict management is to do introspection, is to consider our baseline, because if we come in and we don't have a baseline to work from, there's no way to fix that. You just start shooting arrows in different directions, hoping you hit something. That's not a good practice. So if we at least start with a baseline of understanding what we're after, what it is we're dealing with, we're going to have a much better chance of being able to even identify what we're looking for, what will cause us to go, okay, I'm good with this, or I can make good with this, or whatever. And so knowing ourselves, as you and I had talked even before we came on live, Dave, I think is a key factor here.
Yeah, and I think to that point, unless we have a model to use, we stay in the abstract. Human mind. Think about this: if I said, "Hey, if I'm going to the store, Anton, can I pick you up anything?" As soon as you got to the fourth one, I would be like, "Yo, I need to get a piece of paper and a pen," right? Because we got 3. That's what we can remember before we need a pen.
Yeah.
So if we try and do what you're saying, Kevin, but we don't write anything down, we don't have any structure,
right?
Our preparation it's not going to be very good.
Right.
or a line, or now it's a jumbled bunch of thoughts that are on one page of notes that I have to try and translate to myself when I go back in. So I really want to encourage people, and that's why fundamentally I go back to organizations and I say, how are you standardizing your conflict management? How are you getting people set up so that they can be successful and move? There's a difference between communication and effective communication. There's conflict management and there's effective conflict management. If you're just doing conflict management and it's not effective, it's kind of like that feeling you have when you read a book and you get to the end of the page and you don't even remember what you read. You read it, but did you read it?
Right. Very good. Anton, final comments?
I mean, honestly, I love your focus on how we are, from the state, from within ourselves, whether we're managing conflict, anything else we're doing in life. Too often I hear people give us a bunch of tools, give us a bunch of what and how, but always forget that it all starts with how we are. And, that's a big thing that we focus on here at Prospective Force is really that internal state and coming from a place of balance so you can maintain that balance between logic or emotion. Because if you don't, there's no way you're going to navigate conflict effectively.
Dave, what's the best way for folks to reach out to you?
My email directly is my last name, Gerber, at the word synergy, SYNERGYDT.com. I can maybe put it, is there a way to comment it? I can put it here and you can.
Yeah, that word synergy, Anton.
I love it.
Yeah, I mean, how do we, if we're going to create synergy and we don't have conflict management skills, I mean, you guys are familiar with that book, Good to Great?
Oh, yeah.
We don't have great things. We have very few great things because the amount of work that's required to go from good to great, a lot of people don't feel like the juice is worth the squeeze. When it comes to the conflict management, I want to encourage your audience, stick with it. Ask me questions. I'm more than happy to help. You can find me on LinkedIn. Whatever I can do to help. And I appreciate you guys having me on the show today. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for being on.
Very good. We will be back next Tuesday, everyone. Remember, I know we shifted times on everyone and appreciate those that shifted with us. 8 a.m. on Tuesdays. And we will be addressing another topic next week.
Managing turnover next week.
Okay, dealing with turnover. So I know that's not something that worries too many people. Laugh. Here's our information, prospectiveforce.com. And by the way, tools that are available free is our stress assessment on the website. Feel free to go take that stress assessment. And if you've got a team you want to do that for, we'll do a free interpret on it. So just let us know, reach out, and we look forward to seeing everyone next week. Dave, thanks again. You remind me of getting nerded out on conflict resolution like Anton does on health. You get him wound up and he goes nerd on us, and he's got all the background. So I appreciate you bringing that to the table today. One day, I don't know, maybe I'll be able to get nerdy on something. I don't know what that is, but we'll figure it out. So take care. Have a great week, everyone. And we will see you next Tuesday.